So let's talk about Appendix N. Appendix N is an appendix in this, the first edition of the Dungeon Master's Guide of Dungeons and Dragons, written by Gary Gygax as the lead writer with some editing from others. And Appendix N was the book list of inspirational reading that had really most influenced Gary and to some degree the other early developers of D&D. And it's pretty seminal reading. There's a lot of very classic things on there. There's Lovecraft, there's Conan the Barbarian stories, there's Michael Moorcock, there's Lord Dunsany. There's lots of stuff where this is basic fantasy particularly. There's some sci-fi and horror inflected stuff in there, definitely, but it's chiefly fantasy, and given how much of an influence D&D now is on fantasy, there really is no fantasy industry in the way we have it now, particularly in terms of films, if there isn't D&D. It's pretty relevant to look back at these classic books and think, how have they influenced D&D? And then how has that fed into the wider fantasy genre? So the list, I'll just say the surnames: Anderson, Bellairs, Brackett, Brown, Burroughs, Carter, DeCamp, Derleth, Dunsany, Farmer, Fox, Howard, Lanier, Lieber, Lovecraft, Merritt, Moorcock, Norton, Offut, Pratt, Soberhagen, St. Clair, Tolkien, Vance, Weinbaum, Weldman, Williamson, and Zelazny. And we're going to be starting this series today, the Appendix N chats, with a reflection on this, John Carter of Mars, Barsoom, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I've done a review of the first two books in the series, which I'll put in the description. I'll put a link to that. And at first glance, this, from the 1910s, the first books were published, this is a series that has a lot of dissimilarity with what we think of as D&D. There's a lot of differences between Barsoom and Gygaxian D&D. One, this is strictly speaking, this is strictly speaking science fantasy or science fiction in a broad sense rather than fantasy, normally speaking. It happens in an alien world, technology matters and is something which some effort, not loads, but some effort is gone into speculate upon. But also John Carter is heroic. He does great deeds for the sake of honour and love. Whereas we tend to find in Gygaxian fantasy, there may be some good characters. People do sometimes want to defeat evil, but the adventures are much less driven by either big high motives or by random accident. That's another thing, is that because of the episodic format here, things kind of just happen. They're pieced together by, oh, that's a cool bit of story, what's going to happen next? And so there's differences in structure between the idea of a cohesive Gygaxian world where everything sticks together quite well, and this Barsoomian world where stuff just happens, and there's big thematic differences as well. It's science fiction or fantasy rather than sword and sorcery fantasy in Gygaxian terms, and John Carter is a hero and does things for heroic motives and never thinks about himself or his own gain, whereas Gygaxian D&D heroes, even the good ones, have a brain. They think about what they want and what their objectives and benefits are going to be. Nonetheless, there is actually a lot of inspiration here. These are, look, on Barsoom there are ruined cities of a former great civilization. There are dark cults hidden in the shadows. There are magics, how John Carter gets to Barsoom, for instance, or the psionic abilities of most Martians, the fact they can use telepathy. The technology, technically it's of scientific origin, it's written and it's visualised in fantastic terms. It's very much science fantasy. And I think the fact that we sometimes call this genre Sword and Planet, because, you have John Carter leaping around because of the low gravity. He's so strong comparatively, he's able to leap around. He's got a sword and he's slashing left and right. There's airships, there are underground kingdoms, and the humanoids and the monsters are very D&D as well. So imagistically, visually, it's very D&D. This vast red desert full of ruins and savage races and cults. But the humanoids and the monsters are very D&D too. I think maybe in some ways, the more direct and obvious influence, the most direct and obvious influence, is that there is a monster manual influence. This is the proto-monster manual, if you like. the six-armed green Martians. They're corrupted by long centuries of family neglect, but they are capable of great courage and great nobility. They're great carnivorous white apes. That's actually just something that goes into the Monster Manual direct. Carnivorous plant men in the Valley Door. You get, I think evil plants are great and are underused, and there are plenty in different monster manuals and supplements. So precisely as this was seminal in the sci-fi fantasy genre, it's inevitable it influenced Gygax. But the rich imagery is also a direct influence. That's probably the thing to take away, is less the mechanics of the world and less the adventure style of the world, and more the imagery, particularly, as I say, when we look at the Monster Manual and the direct influence it draws from Barsoom. Are there any other links you can identify if you've read the books? Tell me in the comments. Next time, I think I will be doing, what Appendix N will I do next? Let's have a look. Next month, I'm going to review 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Poul Anderson, and I'm going to do the Appendix N on that. So tune in then if you're interested. Till then.